July 1944. A fortified German hilltop position near Coutances, Normandy. The air is thick with the smell of wet earth and cordite. Rain slicks the grass of the rising slope where German machine guns wait in deep timber-reinforced bunkers. Below the ridge, a battalion of American infantry crouches in the hedgerows, looking up at a wall of fire. A young officer holds a radio handset, his eyes locked on his watch. He has 3 P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers circling just miles away. They are loaded with 500-pound bombs and heavy machine guns. They are ready to clear the path. But the battalion commander pushes the radio away with a sneer. He orders his men to fix bayonets and prepare for a frontal charge against the concrete. It is a decision that will leave 31 men dead in the mud for the sake of a single man's pride. This is the moment when ego outranked experience, and George S. Patton is already on his way to balance the scales. This is the story of how a single commander's refusal to use the tools at his disposal led to a tragic and avoidable loss of life on a French hillside. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when old hierarchies met new realities. These are the forgotten moments where the decisions of the powerful collided with the lives of those on the ground. First Lieutenant Alan Kozlov was 26 years old. He came from Denver, Colorado, where the air was thin and the mountains were sharp. He had been a civil engineer before the draft board called his name. Now, he served as an air liaison officer for the Third Army. He was a man of precision and logic. Kozlov carried a heavy radio set and a map case filled with acetate overlays. His job was to bridge the gap between the dirt and the clouds. He had spent months training with pilots to learn their language. He knew how to talk a P-47 Thunderbolt onto a target the size of a postage stamp. To Kozlov, air power was a mathematical solution to a deadly problem. He had seen enough of Normandy to know that the hedgerows were a graveyard for those who refused to adapt. He had lost his younger brother at Anzio, a death he blamed on poor coordination. That loss made him meticulous. Every coordinate he plotted was a life he intended to save. On that rainy morning near Coutances, he stood in a muddy ditch with his headphones on, listening to the hum of engines overhead. He was ready to provide the miracle of modern warfare to the men around him. Lieutenant Colonel James Rigby was 44 years old. He was a career infantry officer from Tulsa, Oklahoma, with a posture as rigid as a bayonet. Rigby was a man of the old school. He believed in the moral superiority of the foot soldier. He wore a crisp, tailored uniform that seemed to repel the French mud. His boots were polished to a mirror shine by an orderly every morning. Rigby viewed the encroaching technology of the war with a visceral disdain. He often told his junior officers that air support was nothing more than welfare for weak commanders. He kept a small leather notebook in his breast pocket. Inside, he meticulously recorded every objective his battalion took without the help of the Air Corps. He reported these tallies up the chain of command like a holy crusade. He wanted to prove that a determined man with a rifle was the only true instrument of victory. Rigby did not see the Thunderbolt pilots as allies. He saw them as trespassers who stole the glory that rightfully belonged to the infantry. He stood at the command post with his hands behind his back, looking at the fortified hilltop not as a tactical problem, but as a stage for his own personal legend. By July 1944, the lush green fields of Normandy had become a labyrinth of death. Operation Overlord had succeeded in its initial landings, but the Breakout was proving to be a slow and bloody grind. The German army had turned every hedgerow, every stone farmhouse, and every rolling hill into a fortress. These were the days of the Bocage, where visibility was measured in yards and progress was measured in the bodies of young men. To the south of the landings, the Third Army was beginning to stir. Its commanders realizing that the slow tactics of the first few weeks would not be enough to reach Paris. The air was thick with the roar of engines as the Allies held total air superiority. Thousands of sorties were being flown daily, with tactical aircraft acting as the long-range artillery of the front lines. Yet, despite this overwhelming advantage, a friction existed within the American ranks. Many senior officers had spent decades training for a war that no longer existed. They were schooled in the lessons of 1918, where the infantry was the queen of battle and everything else was secondary. They viewed the newly formed Air Corps with suspicion, seeing it as a flashy distraction from the hard, dirty work of ground combat. This was a time of immense transition, where the doctrine of combined arms was being written in real time under fire. While forward-thinking generals were begging for more coordination, some battalion and regimental commanders clung to a misplaced sense of professional purity. They believed that seeking help from the sky was a confession of tactical failure. In the chaotic terrain around Coutances, where German paratroopers and panzer units were dug into the high ground, this refusal to adapt was not just a debate over strategy. It was a death sentence for the privates and sergeants who had to cross the open ground. The hill outside the city stood as a testament to this stubbornness, a silent observer to a commander who valued his tally book more than the lives under his care. Lieutenant Kozlov gripped the handset of his radio as the distant drone of engines grew louder. He checked his map one more time and stepped toward the command post where Colonel Rigby stood watching the ridge through binoculars. The lieutenant cleared his throat and gestured toward the horizon. "Colonel, the P-47s are on station. They are orbiting 5 miles out and waiting for my signal. I have the coordinates for those anti-tank bunkers on the crest. We can have the first wave of 500-pounders on target in less than 10 minutes. It will crack that position wide open before the men even leave the tree line." Rigby did not turn around. He did not even lower his binoculars. He simply shook his head. "No, Lieutenant. Tell your flyboys to find someone else to bother. We don't need them." Kozlov blinked, sure he had been misunderstood. "Sir, with all due respect, that hill is crawling with MG-42s and dug-in 88s. A frontal assault without suppression will be a massacre. The planes are right there. They are already paid for." Rigby finally turned, a cold smirk on his face as he tapped his chest. "You don't get it, do you? Real infantry takes ground with rifles and guts, not by calling the Air Corps to do our job for us. Any commander who needs a nursemaid in the sky to take a hill should turn in his infantry badge right now. This battalion doesn't use crutches." Kozlov looked at the men of Easy Company, checking their gear in the mud nearby. "Sir, this isn't about pride. It is about firepower. Regulation states that air support should be utilized against hardened fortifications to preserve manpower." Rigby stepped closer, his polished boots clicking together. "I don't care what your manuals say. I have a tally to keep. My men are going up that hill the way soldiers are meant to. We are going to take it with cold steel and American grit. I won't have my record stained by a report that says I couldn't handle a few Germans without begging for a flyby. Now, get off that radio and stay out of my way." Kozlov watched in horror as Rigby signaled the whistle. The first wave of men rose from the grass. The German machine guns opened up instantly, a rhythmic tearing sound that cut through the morning air. Kozlov watched through his own glass as 31 men were cut down in the first 60 seconds. The planes circled uselessly above until their fuel ran low, and they were diverted to a unit 3 miles south. By evening, the hill was still held by the enemy, and the slope was littered with olive-drab jackets that didn't move. Kozlov sat in the dark and wrote his report. He included the exact time of his offer, the availability of the aircraft, and the colonel's exact words. The report reached Patton within the hour. The command post grew silent as the distinctive sound of a high-velocity jeep engine cut through the rain. Patton arrived within the hour. He stepped out of the vehicle before it had even fully stopped, his tall frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the gray Normandy sky. The 4 silver stars on his helmet caught the dull light, and the ivory grips of his revolvers rested prominently on his hips. He didn't look at the mud. He didn't look at the officers who snapped to attention. He looked directly at the hilltop, where the bodies of 31 men still lay in the tall grass. Patton walked into the command tent without a word, his spurs jingling softly on the wooden floorboards. He stopped in front of Rigby, his eyes cold and fixed. "Colonel, I have been reading a very interesting log from your air liaison officer. It says you had 3 P-47s on station before you launched your attack this morning. Is that correct?" Rigby stood stiffly, his chin tucked in. "Yes, General, they were available." Patton tilted his head slightly. "And you were provided with the exact coordinates of the enemy anti-tank guns and machine gun nests. Is that also correct?" Rigby cleared his throat, his voice maintaining its practiced edge. "I was, sir. But I made the command decision that those targets were best handled by my infantry." Patton's voice remained low, which was far more dangerous than a shout. "And why did you believe your men were better equipped to handle concrete bunkers than 500-pound bombs, Colonel?" Rigby puffed out his chest. I believe in the spirit of the infantry, General. I believe that reliance on air support breeds a lack of tactical discipline. I wanted to prove that my battalion could take any objective with rifles and bayonets. I keep a record of these successes to show what a determined unit can do." Patton leaned in until he was inches from Rigby's face. "You kept a record," he said. "You sacrificed 31 Americans to fill a notebook. You stand here and talk to me about the spirit of the infantry while your men are rotting on a slope you failed to take. I use every weapon I have. I use tanks, I use artillery, I use planes, and I use engineers. I use every ounce of firepower the American people have provided me to kill Germans and save my men. A commander who refuses available firepower isn't brave. He's wasteful. He is a murderer of his own troops. You didn't leave those men out there for the sake of infantry pride. You left them there for your own pride. You thought you were being tough, but you were being stupid. You fought with one hand tied behind your back because you wanted to look like a hero in a report. Those 31 men didn't die for their country. They died for your ego. You have 2 minutes to pack your personal effects. You are relieved of command. You will be stripped of your infantry badge, and you will spend the rest of this war overseeing a supply depot in the rear where the only thing you'll be allowed to count is crates of canned meat. If I see your face near a frontline unit again, I will have you court-martialed for cowardice, because that is what this is. You were too afraid to admit you needed help, and your men paid the price. Get out of my sight." The removal of Lieutenant Colonel Rigby was not a quiet affair. Patton made sure of that. As the rain continued to beat down on the mud-slicked canvas of the command tent, the general ordered the battalion's officers to assemble in the open air. Under the gray, weeping sky, Rigby was forced to stand before the very men he had commanded. He was stripped of his silver oak leaves and his combat infantryman badge, right there in the mud, his hands trembling as the symbols of his authority were torn away. Patton then turned to the air liaison officer, Kozlov, and ordered him to bring the planes back. Within 20 minutes, the sound of the P-47s returned, a low, guttural thrum that shook the earth. The men watched from the safety of the tree line as the Thunderbolts dove. They saw the flash of the 500-pound bombs and felt the shock waves roll through the ground. The fortified German bunkers that had claimed 31 lives were reduced to jagged craters and splintered timber in a single pass. When the smoke cleared, the infantry moved up the hill without losing another soul. They found the German defenders dazed, broken, and buried under the rubble of their own hubris. Rigby was marched to the rear on foot, a disgraced figure carrying a single duffel bag, passing the very stretch of road where the bodies of his men were being loaded into trucks. The silence from the surviving soldiers as he walked past was louder than any shout. Alan Kozlov returned home to Denver in late 1945. He never went back to engineering. Instead, he dedicated his life to teaching mountain search and rescue. Specializing in radio coordination and logistics, he lived to be 84, passing away in 2003. In his study, tucked away in a cedar box, he kept the original coordinates he had plotted for the hilltop near Coutances. He never spoke about the 31 men to his children, but his wife often found him staring at the mountains when the summer storms rolled in, listening to the thunder that sounded like radial engines. He died knowing that every life he saved in the Rockies was a small payment toward a debt he never truly owed. James Rigby served out the remainder of the war in a series of forgotten supply depots across France and occupied Germany. He was never promoted again. He returned to Oklahoma in 1946 and attempted to enter local politics, but his reputation had followed him home. The men who had served under him spoke in whispers, and the whispers eventually became a public record of his failure. He lived a long, bitter life in a house filled with military memorabilia and a collection of journals that no one ever wanted to read. He died in 1982, still insisting to anyone who would listen that the Army had lost its soul the day it stopped trusting the man with the rifle. He never acknowledged the cost of his tally book. Patton mentioned the incident only once in a private letter to his wife, Beatrice. He wrote that the hardest part of command was not killing the enemy, but protecting his soldiers from the vanity of their own officers. He kept the Air Liaison report in a specific folder marked for training references at the 3rd Army headquarters. He believed that the lesson was more important than the man. To Patton, the 31 men were a tragedy, but the survival of the rest of the army depended on ensuring that no other commander ever confused stubbornness with bravery again. He carried that conviction until his own end in December 1945. Some historians have argued that the friction between ground commanders and the Air Corps was an inevitable byproduct of a rapidly evolving doctrine. They point to the technical difficulties of early close air support and the very real danger of friendly fire as reasons why a seasoned officer might hesitate to trust the sky. These scholars suggest that Rigby was a product of his era, shaped by a military culture that prioritized the independent capability of the infantry above all else. Others argue the opposite, insisting that by the summer of 1944, the effectiveness of tactical air power was an established fact that only a dangerously negligent commander would ignore. They contend that Patton's swift intervention was a necessary correction to a culture of ego that threatened the efficiency of the entire Allied advance. What is certain is that the events at Coutances became a foundational case study in the implementation of combined arms warfare, fundamentally changing how the United States Army coordinated its greatest strengths on the battlefield. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have simply let the bureaucracy handle the fallout? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happened when old hierarchies met new realities, make sure you subscribe.